Who's behind the spate of assaults and attacks against Asian Americans? And just as important, why? I was on with Jesse Waters on Fox over the weekend to talk about this. And Jesse Waters fully knows the answer to the first question, which is the who. But he was really befuddled by my answer to the second question, which is the why. So let's go through this. Waters, in fact, laid out a series of horrific assaults against Asian Americans. You have an African-American, Patrick Thompson, walking up to and stabbing two elderly Asian women in Market Street in San Francisco. I'm now reading a headline from the New York Post. 2 Asian women beaten with a cinder block in Baltimore. The suspect, Daryl Doles, age 50, African-American. A Baltimore man arrested after he repeatedly struck 2 Asian women, 66 and 67, in the head with a cinder block. This was on video. And an arrest was made, and the perpetrator, African-American, and on it goes. An Asian woman was slapped on a Brooklyn subway train by a black female who made racist comments, including the phrase, "You don't belong here." DC police are trying to find a black male suspect who has punched an Asian store owner who says, "F you Chinese people, I hate you." Interestingly, in the media reports on this, there's been a suppression of the race of the perpetrator. And this is to fulfill the narrative of white supremacy. White supremacy is to blame, in fact, I think one of the dumbest Asians in America. This is an anti-Trump Asian doctor. His name is Eugene Gu. He goes, "Black on Asian crimes occur because of our system of white supremacy." So this is, here's a guy parroting the leftist narrative. But that narrative makes absolutely no sense. Whites aren't doing this. It's being done by African Americans. By the way, there's a new Asian American Foundation which lists a series of crimes of violence against Asian Americans. This is called the Asian American Foundation. And interestingly, they name the race of the perpetrator only when the perpetrator is white. When the perpetrator is black, they say nothing. So this is an effort to doctor the facts, to create a false narrative, if you will. But this, of course, raises the question, what is the true narrative? If it is the case, as it is, that African Americans are disproportionately the villains of this story, they're the ones attacking the Asian Americans, the deep question is why? So here's what I said to Jesse Waters. We think of racism, we think of hate crimes as a group that thinks it's superior, attacking others that they deem to be inferior. And of course, racism in America has traditionally taken this form. Whites are superior, blacks are inferior. So you're looking down on another group and you identify, we come to identify racism this way. But there's a whole different kind of bigotry that is resentment and hatred directed at people who are deemed to be more successful. This is racism or bigotry rooted in envy. Somebody else is doing better than you. You are filled with frustration and rage at their success. You don't know why that success doesn't belong to you. Not only is that success humiliating to you, but more importantly, it destroys the excuses for your own failure. You're like, well, I'm African American, and the reason I can't succeed is because no person of color can succeed in America. You see, America's defined by white supremacy. Wait a minute. Here's a Pakistani, here's a guy from Thailand, here's a guy from Malaysia, here's a guy from China. They've all moved into my neighborhood. Their kids are doing really well in school. They're planning to move into the suburbs. They're achieving the American dream. They're destroying my narrative. They're undermining the whole white supremacy gobbledygook. They're basically showing that the American recipe of success works. Now, no one is saying, not for a minute, that Asian Americans are genetically better, Asian Americans are superior. No. Asian Americans are successful because they have, in a sense, embraced a culture which you could almost call the old Protestant work ethic. Confucian culture, whether you want to call it Asian culture or traditional Asian Indian culture, these cultures bear a close similarity to what people used to call the Yankee work ethic, which is basically you have tight-knit families, you study hard, you save a lot of money, you work cooperatively to generate capital, you emphasize entrepreneurial business formation. All of these are the characteristics of successful groups everywhere in the world. So the point I made to Jesse Waters is what we're seeing here is that the least successful group in America, African Americans, are attacking members of the most successful group. And I say most successful group because if you look at any measure of academic achievement or economic performance, there's a huge body of data on this, and it's been collected now over 30 years. You find the results are predictable. Asian Americans are on top. Whites are kind of in the middle. This is why it's so amusing when I keep hearing about relinquish your white privilege, give up your white privilege. I'm thinking whites don't have any privilege. Whites aren't on the top of society. They're not at the top of the rung anymore. So the bottom line of it here is that the presence of Asian Americans, the success of Asian Americans is a, you may say, walking refutation of the idiotic woke narrative. It undermines all this nonsense about structural racism. It knocks it over. And so there's a desperate desire to reconstruct the narrative. They have to trot out this idiot, Eugene Gu. White supremacy is still doing it. They're still doing it. They're making Asian Americans from poor families score higher on math tests than African Americans from middle and upper middle class families. How? Tell us how that happens, Eugene Gu. Now, this all reminds me of the old scene from the movie, and it was Spike Lee's movie called Do the Right Thing a long time ago, where, you got this poor Asian guy, and he starts a grocery store. And all the blacks in the neighborhood are really angry. Why do we have to patronize an Asian grocery store? And Cedric the Entertainer, this big fat guy in the movie, goes, yeah, that's because they work hard, they make stuff, we don't make the same kind of stuff. I'm going to go over there and get myself a burger. And of course, they ultimately threaten this guy. They want to beat him up. They want to riot against him. And finally, the poor Korean grocery store owner goes, I'm not white, I'm black. Like you, I'm the same. So here's the poor guy trying to identify with his attackers so that he can sort of disassociate himself from the kind of stigma that they're trying to put on him. The point I wasn't able to make with Jesse Waters is this: worldwide, successful groups are targeted for attack. Think of the Jews, for example, in Germany. One of the attacks on the Jews was the fact that the Jews run the banks, the Jews run the institutions of finance, the Jews dominate the media. Jews are successful in all these important professions, and this stimulates the hatred and envy of ordinary Germans who feel they're not doing as well. The overseas Chinese dominate the economies of a whole bunch of Asian countries. They're dominant in places like Thailand and Malaysia. And so the native-born Malay and the native-born Filipinos think, oh, these horrible Chinese, they're so evil, they're so wicked. And so there's a racism that develops toward these groups, but it's not a racism by looking down. In some ways, it's a racism by looking up. You're looking at people who are doing better. And of course, you convince yourself that the reason they're doing better is not because they work harder, not because they have a better cultural ecosystem. It's because they're ultimately wicked. They're managing some sort of conspiracy against us. You have to sort of root them out of the society. So I think my conclusion is that there are two types of bigotry, and they operate simultaneously. One is the kind of traditional bigotry, groups that think of themselves as better, looking down on groups that think of themselves that they deem to be somehow worse. But there's a second, less visible type of bigotry, very much present in this case, where groups that are not doing well blame their difficulties on other groups that are quite manifestly succeeding and claiming their share of the American dream.